My worker complained about the lazy owner for 45 minutes, not knowing I was the owner he talked about. I walked into the break room at my manufacturing plant wearing jeans and an old college hoodie, carrying my lunch in a paper bag like I always did. The place was buzzing with the usual midday crowd, workers grabbing quick meals before heading back to their stations. I'd owned this company for 15 years after buying it from my mentor, who'd taught me everything about the business, and I made it a point to dress like everyone else when I visited the floor. No fancy suits or executive badges, just comfortable clothes that let me blend in and see how things really ran when nobody knew the boss was watching. I spotted an empty seat at one of the long tables and sat down next to a guy I'd seen around but never formally met. He was maybe mid-30s with a perpetual scowl and was already mid-conversation with two other workers across from us. I nodded hello and started unwrapping my sandwich while they continued talking about last night's game. The conversation was normal enough until the guy next to me, whose name tag read Dennis, suddenly shifted topics and started complaining about management. Dennis launched into a rant about how the owner never showed his face on the floor and probably sat in his office counting money all day while real workers busted their backs. The two guys across from us nodded along, clearly having heard this speech before. I kept my expression neutral and took a bite of my sandwich, listening carefully as Dennis described in detail how he imagined I spent my days. According to him, I rolled into work around noon in a luxury car, took 3-hour lunches at expensive restaurants, and left by 4 without ever setting foot in the actual plant. He said the owner clearly didn't care about the people who made him rich and probably couldn't even operate the machinery if his life depended on it. One of the other guys mentioned he'd heard the owner was some rich kid who inherited the business, which wasn't true at all since I'd bought it with money I'd saved from working 2 jobs for a decade. But I didn't correct him, just kept eating and listening while Dennis got more animated with each complaint. He was really warming up now, gesturing with his sandwich and raising his voice enough that people at nearby tables were starting to glance over. Dennis went on to say that the owner probably didn't even know half the workers' names and definitely didn't appreciate how hard everyone worked to keep production numbers up. He complained about the lack of raises this year, which stung because we'd actually given modest increases to 70% of the staff based on performance reviews. I knew not everyone got raises because not everyone deserved them, but apparently Dennis felt entitled to more money regardless of his contribution. He started listing all the ways he thought the owner was incompetent, including the recent decision to upgrade our quality control systems, which Dennis called a waste of money that could have gone to worker bonuses. I happened to know that quality control upgrade had already caught 3 major defects that would have cost us a huge client contract, but Dennis clearly didn't have that information. His buddy across the table asked if Dennis had ever actually seen the owner, and Dennis snorted and said he wouldn't recognize him if he walked right past him in the hallway. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat there 6 inches from his elbow, drinking my water and letting him continue. The rant continued for another 10 minutes as Dennis described how he'd been working at the plant for 8 months and had never once received recognition for his contributions. He said he worked harder than anyone else on his line and that the owner probably didn't even know his name or care about his excellent attendance record. I made a mental note to check Dennis's file later because I had a feeling his version of events might not match reality. One of the other workers tried to change the subject, but Dennis was on a roll now, complaining about the break room coffee being cheap and the parking lot needing repaving and a dozen other issues both valid and petty. Some of his complaints were actually fair points that I'd already been working on with my operations manager, but others were just whining about normal workplace inconveniences that every company dealt with. Dennis declared that if he ever met the owner face-to-face, he'd tell him exactly what he thought about how the place was being run, and that someone needed to give the boss a reality check about what actually happened on the floor. The 2 guys across from us were starting to look uncomfortable now, probably sensing that Dennis was going too far, but he didn't pick up on their body language at all. I finished my sandwich and wadded up the paper bag, still not saying anything while Dennis pivoted to complaining about the company's safety protocols. He called them overkill and said the owner was probably just worried about lawsuits rather than actually caring about worker safety. This one particularly annoyed me because we'd implemented those protocols after a serious accident at a competitor's plant had injured 3 people, and I'd spent weeks working with safety consultants to make sure our people were protected. Dennis's dismissive attitude toward those measures told me a lot about his judgment and priorities. He went on to say that the owner had probably never worked a real day in his life and wouldn't last 2 hours doing actual manual labor. I'd actually started in this industry running machines on a factory floor and had worked my way up over 15 years, but again, I didn't correct his assumptions. One of the other workers glanced at his watch and said he needed to get back to his station, clearly looking for an escape from Dennis's monologue. Dennis barely noticed as the guy left, immediately turning his attention to complaining about the company's health insurance plan. The health insurance complaint was particularly rich because we offered one of the better plans in the area after I'd specifically negotiated with providers to get comprehensive coverage for our employees. Dennis claimed the deductibles were too high and the owner probably had some premium plan while everyone else got screwed with bare minimum coverage. In reality, I had the exact same plan as everyone else because I believed in leading by example, but Dennis had constructed this entire narrative about evil management that didn't match reality at all. He said he'd heard the owner lived in some mansion on the lake and drove multiple luxury cars, showing how out of touch he was with regular people. I actually lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood and drove a truck that was 7 years old, but I was curious how far Dennis would go with his fictional version of my life. The remaining worker across from us was now actively avoiding eye contact and eating his lunch very quickly, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Dennis didn't notice or didn't care, launching into a story about how his friend at another company had an owner who actually cared about employees and treated them with respect. I checked my watch and realized Dennis had been complaining for over 30 minutes straight without barely pausing for breath. The guy had stamina, I'd give him that. He circled back to his original complaint about the owner never being visible on the floor, saying it showed a complete lack of leadership and engagement. He declared that a real leader would be down here every day, talking to workers and understanding their concerns instead of hiding in an ivory tower. The thing was, I actually did come down to the floor regularly, just not in a way that announced my presence with fanfare. I believed you learned more by observing quietly than by having everyone put on a show because the boss was watching. But Dennis had apparently never noticed me during any of my previous visits, which said something about his awareness of his surroundings. He moved on to complaining about the production quotas, calling them unrealistic and proof that management didn't understand how the work actually got done. I knew for a fact those quotas were based on careful time studies and were consistently met by most of the workforce, which suggested the problem might be Dennis's efficiency rather than the standards themselves. The last worker at our table finally gave up on his lunch and excused himself, leaving just me and Dennis sitting there. Dennis barely acknowledged him leaving, too caught up in his complaints to notice he'd lost his audience except for me. He started talking about how the owner probably got his job through connections rather than merit, and how that's what was wrong with business in general. He said people like that never understood what it meant to actually work for a living and just coasted on privilege and family money. Every assumption he made was wrong, but I let him continue, fascinated by how someone could be so confident while being so completely misinformed. Dennis said he'd been thinking about looking for another job because he didn't want to work for someone who didn't value his contributions. He asked me if I'd ever thought about leaving, and I shook my head and said I was pretty happy with my situation here. Dennis looked at me like I was crazy and said he didn't understand how anyone could be satisfied working for such a disconnected and incompetent owner. I almost laughed but managed to keep my expression neutral. Dennis glanced at his watch and swore, saying his break ended 5 minutes ago, and his supervisor was probably going to write him up for being late again. The word again suggested this was a pattern, which explained some things about his employment record. He stood up and grabbed his trash, still muttering about management and how unfair everything was. I asked him casually what department he worked in, and he said he was in assembly on the B line, then asked why I wanted to know. I shrugged and said I was just curious since I was relatively new and trying to learn everyone's names and roles. Dennis snorted and said good luck with that since there were over 200 people in the plant and management didn't care enough to know any of them anyway. He walked off toward the production floor, leaving his complaints hanging in the air like a bad smell. I sat there for another minute, finishing my water and thinking about everything I'd just heard. Some of his complaints were valid concerns I should address, but most of it was just uninformed griping from someone who'd rather blame others than look at his own performance. I gathered my trash and headed toward the administrative wing, nodding to workers I passed in the hallway. Several of them greeted me by name, which contradicted Dennis's claim that I was invisible and unknowable. I made my way to my office and found my operations manager, Claudia, waiting with the weekly production reports. She asked how my lunch was, and I told her it had been very educational. I asked her to pull Dennis's employee file and bring it to my office, along with his supervisor's recent evaluations. Claudia raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions, just nodded and left to get the information. While I waited, I pulled up our HR system and looked at Dennis's record myself. He'd been hired 8 months ago, like he said, and his attendance was actually decent with only 2 absences. But his performance reviews told a different story than the one he'd been selling at lunch. His supervisor had noted multiple times that Dennis had a negative attitude and frequently complained about assignments rather than just doing the work. His production numbers were consistently in the bottom 20% of his team, and he'd received 2 verbal warnings about extended breaks. Claudia returned with a physical file and sat down across from my desk. She said Dennis had been on her radar for a few weeks because his supervisor had been documenting issues in preparation for a potential performance improvement plan. She asked if something specific had happened, and I told her about the lunch conversation, giving her the highlights of Dennis's 45-minute monologue about what a terrible owner I was. Claudia winced and said she could guess where this was going. I asked her to set up a meeting with Dennis and his supervisor for later this afternoon, and to make sure Dennis understood it was mandatory. She nodded and said she'd take care of it, then asked if I wanted her to sit in on the meeting. I said yes because I wanted a witness to whatever conversation we were about to have. Claudia left to make the arrangements, and I spent the next hour reviewing Dennis's complete file, including his original job application and interview notes. Nothing in his background suggested he'd be a problem employee, but clearly something had gone wrong since he'd started. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the small conference room near my office. I arrived a few minutes early and found Dennis's supervisor, a veteran employee named Russell, already waiting. Russell had been with the company for 12 years and was one of my most reliable managers, someone who knew how to balance pushing for productivity with treating his team fairly. He asked if this was about Dennis, and I confirmed it was. Russell sighed and said he'd been afraid this was coming because Dennis's attitude had been getting worse over the past few months. He said Dennis seemed to think the rules didn't apply to him and that he deserved special treatment despite his mediocre performance. Russell had tried coaching and direct feedback, but nothing seemed to get through to Dennis, who always had an excuse or blamed someone else for his shortcomings. Claudia arrived with Dennis a few minutes later, and I could see the confusion on Dennis's face when he realized he was being led to a meeting with people he didn't recognize. Russell, he knew, but Claudia and I were strangers to him despite the fact that I'd sat next to him at lunch just a few hours ago. Dennis sat down across from me looking annoyed and asked what this was about because he needed to get back to his station. Russell started to speak, but I held up a hand and said I'd take this one. I introduced myself by name and title and watched Dennis's face go from annoyed to confused to absolutely horrified as he realized who I was. The color drained from his face and his mouth opened and closed a few times without any sound coming out. I let the silence hang there for a moment before saying I'd had a very interesting lunch today where I'd learned a lot about what one of my employees thought of me and my leadership. Dennis started stammering out an apology, but I cut him off and said I wasn't interested in apologies right now. I was interested in facts. I asked him to tell me about his performance over the past 8 months, and specifically why he thought he deserved recognition when his numbers were consistently at the bottom of his team. Dennis's stammering got worse, and he looked to Russell for help, but Russell just sat there with his arms crossed, waiting for Dennis to answer the question. I walked Dennis through his performance record point by point, contrasting what he'd said at lunch with what his file actually showed. He'd claimed he worked harder than anyone else, but his production numbers said otherwise. He'd said he had perfect attendance, but he actually had 2 absences and a pattern of extended breaks. He'd claimed he never got recognition, but I could see from his file that Russell had given him positive feedback on the few occasions when Dennis actually performed well. Every complaint Dennis had made about being undervalued fell apart when confronted with documentation of his actual performance. I asked him if he could explain the discrepancy between his perception and reality, and Dennis just sat there looking at his hands. Finally, he mumbled something about how the quotas were too high, and he was doing the best he could. I pointed out that 70% of his coworkers had no trouble meeting those same quotas, which suggested the problem wasn't the standards. Russell added that he'd offered Dennis additional training multiple times, but Dennis had always refused, saying he already knew how to do the job. I moved on to Dennis's complaints about me personally, the ones where he'd painted me as some lazy, disconnected rich kid who'd never worked a day in my life. I gave him a brief summary of my actual background, including the 2 jobs I'd worked to save up money to buy this business, the 15 years I'd spent learning every aspect of the operation, and the regular floor visits where I observed and listened without announcing myself. I asked Dennis if he remembered ever seeing me on the floor before today, and he shook his head. I said that was interesting because I'd been within 20 feet of him at least a dozen times over the past 8 months, but he'd been too busy complaining to his coworkers to notice. Dennis looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. I told him that some of his complaints at lunch were actually fair points that I was already working to address, like the parking lot and some of the break room amenities. But the way he'd presented those concerns, wrapped in personal attacks and false assumptions, made it impossible for me to take him seriously as someone who wanted to improve the workplace. I asked Dennis why he'd stayed with the company for 8 months if he was so unhappy, and he didn't have a good answer. He mumbled something about the job market and needing the income, which was honest at least. I told him that I understood not every job was a perfect fit, and that sometimes the best thing for everyone was to part ways. Dennis's eyes widened, and he asked if I was firing him. I said I was giving him a choice because I believed in treating people fairly, even when they'd been trash-talking me for 45 minutes straight. Option 1 was a performance improvement plan, where he'd work closely with Russell to bring his numbers up to acceptable standards and fix his attitude problems. The plan would last 90 days, and if he couldn't meet the clearly defined goals, his employment would be terminated. Option 2 was to resign today with 2 weeks of severance pay and a neutral reference that simply confirmed his dates of employment. I told him to think about it for exactly 5 minutes and then let me know his decision. Dennis sat in silence for those 5 minutes while Claudia checked her phone and Russell stared at the wall. I could see Dennis's mind working, probably calculating his finances and job prospects against the humiliation of staying here after everything he'd said. When the 5 minutes were up, I asked for his decision. Dennis cleared his throat and said he'd take the severance package and resign. I nodded and told Claudia to draw up the paperwork. I asked Dennis if he'd learned anything from this experience, and he finally made eye contact with me for the first time. He said quietly that he'd learned not to judge people based on assumptions, and that he should have focused more on his own performance instead of criticizing others. I told him that was a good start, and that I hoped he'd take those lessons to his next job. I also told him that despite everything, I didn't wish him ill, and hoped he'd find a position that was a better fit for his skills and attitude. Dennis nodded and thanked me, which seemed genuine even if it was motivated by wanting to leave with the severance intact. Claudia escorted Dennis to HR to complete his exit paperwork, while Russell stayed behind. Russell said he was sorry he hadn't dealt with Dennis's attitude problems more aggressively earlier, but I told him he'd documented everything properly, and that was what mattered. I asked Russell to share the story with his other supervisors as a teaching moment about the importance of maintaining professionalism and not making assumptions. Russell agreed and asked if I wanted him to address Dennis's complaints about me with his team. I thought about it and said yes, but to keep it factual rather than defensive. Let them know that I do visit the floor regularly, that I do care about working conditions, and that I'm always open to constructive feedback delivered through appropriate channels. Russell said he'd handle it and left to get back to his shift. I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes, thinking about the whole bizarre situation. Part of me was angry at Dennis's disrespect, but another part understood that he'd constructed a narrative to explain his own dissatisfaction without having complete information. Later that afternoon, I called a brief meeting with my management team to discuss what had happened and what we could learn from it. I told them the full story about Dennis's lunch rant and the subsequent meeting and asked for their honest feedback about whether there was truth in any of his complaints. My production manager said that communication from leadership could always be better and that maybe I should consider more visible floor walks instead of trying to blend in. My HR director suggested we implement more regular town halls where employees could ask questions and raise concerns directly. My CFO pointed out that we'd had good financial results this quarter, and maybe we could accelerate some of the facility improvements that employees had been asking for. These were all good suggestions, and I told them to start working on implementation plans. I wanted Dennis's complaints, even if poorly delivered, to result in positive changes that would benefit everyone. That was the difference between destructive criticism and constructive feedback, and I wanted my team to understand that distinction. Over the next few weeks, I made a point of being more visible on the floor, introducing myself to workers who didn't know me and having brief conversations about their roles and concerns. The reactions were mixed, with some people seeming nervous about talking to the owner and others appreciating the direct access. I implemented monthly town halls where anyone could ask questions, and while attendance was sparse at first, it gradually improved as people realized it was a safe space for honest dialogue. We accelerated the parking lot repaving and upgraded the break room coffee to a better quality brand, two of Dennis's minor complaints that were easy wins. I also worked with Russell to identify high performers who deserved recognition, and we implemented a quarterly awards program with small bonuses for top achievers. None of these changes were earth-shattering, but they showed that I was listening and responsive to legitimate concerns. Several workers mentioned that they'd heard about what happened with Dennis, and while the details were probably garbled through the rumor mill, the general message had gotten through that talking trash about the owner to a stranger might backfire spectacularly. I never saw Dennis again after that day, but I heard through the grapevine that he'd found another job at a smaller manufacturing plant across town. I hoped he'd learned something from our encounter and would approach his new position with a better attitude. The whole experience had taught me some valuable lessons too, about the importance of clear communication and the danger of letting employees construct false narratives about leadership. I realized that my preference for quiet observation had some benefits, but also created information gaps that people filled with assumptions and speculation. Finding the right balance between being accessible and being overbearing was tricky, but I was committed to improving. I also learned that sometimes the harshest critics have the weakest performance records, and that people who spend all their time complaining often do so to avoid looking at their own shortcomings. Dennis had been so convinced of his own excellence and my incompetence that he'd never stopped to question whether his perceptions matched reality. 6 months later, I was back in that same break room having lunch and happened to sit with some of the workers from the B line, the team Dennis had been on. They were chatting about normal stuff when one of them mentioned they'd gotten a new team member who was working out much better than the last guy they'd had. Another worker laughed and said, "Yeah, at least this one doesn't spend half his break complaining about everything." They didn't mention Dennis by name, but I knew who they meant. I asked how the new person was working out, and they said great, really positive attitude and solid production numbers. It was a reminder that sometimes addition by subtraction is the best move for a team, and that removing one negative voice can improve morale for everyone else. I finished my lunch and headed back to my office, passing through the production floor where machines hummed and workers focused on their tasks. The place wasn't perfect and never would be, but it was running well and most people seemed reasonably content with their jobs. That was all I could realistically hope for as an owner. The Dennis incident became something of a legend at the plant. One of those stories that got told to new hires as a cautionary tale about assumptions and professionalism. I heard various versions of it over the following years, some accurate and some wildly embellished. In one version, I'd supposedly fired Dennis on the spot in the break room in front of everyone, which wasn't remotely true but made for a more dramatic story. I didn't bother correcting the exaggerations because the core message was sound, regardless of the specific details. Be careful what you say about people you don't know, because you never know who might be listening. Focus on your own performance before criticizing others. Treat everyone with basic respect even if you think they're beneath your notice. These weren't complicated lessons, but apparently they needed to be learned through experience for some people. Dennis had provided that experience in spectacular fashion, and while I doubted he'd thanked me for it, I hoped he'd grown from it nonetheless. As for me, I continued my quiet observations and regular check-ins, always learning and always trying to improve both the business and myself as a leader. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.